Thank you for joining us for the latest episode of the Balancing Act podcast. Today we are joined by SingerLewak Tax Director Mike Mondelli and SingerLewak Tax Partner Mark Cook. Mike is going to go into detail about what to expect during an IRS examination. He's going to explain what the process is like and how to respond when the IRS contacts you. Keep listening to learn more.
So this podcast will be organized in a bit of a Q&A session. I'll ask Mike questions, and he'll provide some insights into the IRS and what to expect if you're notified of an examination. So, Mike, thanks for being here with us. Mike, the first question is, can you give us an overview of the IRS divisions?
Sure. Thanks, Mark. So there's a number of different divisions in the IRS. They love acronyms at the IRS, so everything gets reduced to a series of letters, but there's the Small Business and Self-Employed, or SBSE division, Large Business and International, LBNI, TEGE, Tax Exempt and Governmental Entities, Criminal Investigation, CI, and Wage and Investment, WNI. And each one deals with a different subset of taxpayers and tax returns. As the names generally indicate, the Small Business and Self-Employed division deals with taxpayers that have a small business. It's not the large C corps. It might be a sole proprietor or S corp under a certain dollar amount. And then the LBNI, or Large Business and International division, deals with those larger corporations, large partnerships, international tax issues. TEGE deals with a lot of not-for-profit clients or taxpayers, private foundations, 990 PFs, and so forth. Wage and Investment primarily deals with small issues, things like the matching notices that your clients receive, saying that someone reported a different amount of W-2 or 1099 income than showed up on the tax return. And the Criminal Investigation Division does criminal investigations for prosecutorial referrals to the Department of Justice, criminal tax matters. So each one deals with a little bit different subset of the tax world.
The next question I think most of us are wondering about are what are the different types of examinations that the IRS does?
Yeah, they generally fall into one of three different types of examinations. And what people that aren't in the tax world think of as an IRS audit, the IRS calls an examination, primarily because the word audit means something in the finance and accounting world that it doesn't mean an IRS test. So it's an IRS examination is the same thing as an IRS audit to folks out there on the street. But the simplest and most straightforward type of examination is a correspondence examination that's typically done through the mail, where the IRS agent would ask for copies of documentation, returns, so forth. It goes back and forth between the mail, and it's very limited in scope. The second type of examination is an office examination. That's where the taxpayer or the taxpayer's representative goes into the IRS office, meets with a examining agent there, and it's also a more limited scope examination. Typically, fewer issues are examined in the office. And the third type of examination is a field examination. That's where a revenue agent goes out in the field, meaning to the taxpayer's home, the taxpayer's place of business, or their representative's offices, like a CPA or tax attorney's office. And those field examinations generally are wider in scope than either the correspondence or office examinations. They would look at more issues. They could potentially request more records, and they usually last longer than the other types of limited scope examinations. There's a few different ways that a tax return gets selected. One way is a random selection as part of what the IRS calls the National Research Program, or NRP. Those examinations are really time consuming because you have to substantiate or provide documentation and evidence for every line item on the return. So we hope that most of our clients don't ever get picked for those random NRP examinations. But there's also issue-specific things like a project on a certain line item on a tax return that the IRS is very interested in. So they will grab a whole bunch of tax returns that have something reported on that particular line item. Or they might have a project on a specific type of industry that they can identify which taxpayers are in that based on if they report something under their NAICS code on the tax return. They might select a bunch of returns with that code on it and try to do some industry examining. And sometimes there are projects on a specific preparer, a tax return preparer, if the IRS suspects that there's something funny going on from the tax return preparer's office. Then the main way that tax returns are selected is through what the IRS calls large, unusual, or questionable items that they call LUQs. And those can really be any one thing on a tax return or a few things or many things if they vary greatly from sort of the national averages, either for that issue, that line item on the tax return across year to year for that particular individual or business, or against national standards because they have data from everyone that files. Each return gets a unique score called a diff score, and the way that that's calculated is a highly guarded secret. Very few people know, but if your diff score reaches a certain level, it may result in your return being selected for examination. And people generally like to ask, why was my return chosen? And at the end of the day, it's mostly irrelevant because once you're selected for examination, you have to go through the process. And there's usually nothing you could do to change it for the future or stop it from happening again. If it's something was large, unusual, or questionable on your return, the numbers speak for themselves. Many times these things do happen randomly. And if they do, we'll just deal with it as they come up.
That's really helpful. What is the examination process like? Is it similar for all clients? I guess it depends on which kind of examination it is, correspondence office or field, but what is the process like once you sort of get into it?
Yeah, it definitely depends on which division of the IRS is running the examination. So if it's an SBSE or in the small business and self-employed division, it's going to be a lot less formalized than the LB&I division or the large business and international. With the SBSE agents, usually there's not as much planning at the beginning of the examination, meaning they won't tell you exactly what the timeline is and exactly what the issues are. You will just start getting some document requests and ask for extensions on deadlines and so forth as you go through the process. In the LB&I examinations, it's much more formalized, especially when it comes to information document requests or IDRs. They will send draft IDRs out so that the taxpayer and their representatives can help narrow the scope of what's asked for, because they have very, very formalized deadlines for those LB&I document requests. And if you don't meet the deadlines, they are willing to give you an extension, but not indefinitely. And if you don't eventually start giving over the documents that are requested, the LB&I agents will send things on for what they call IDR enforcement. It's just a lot more rigid and formalized when you're dealing with the LB&I agents, and the SBSE agents, it's just a little more less formal. There's less strict timelines, and the agents and their managers in the SBSE have a little bit more flexibility to grant extension than the LB&I agents do.
So when the IRS starts an examination, they start sending out document requests and asking to interview the client. Sort of what do we do at that point?
Yeah, I always suggest that the clients have someone like us here at SingerLewak represent them before the IRS. As long as we have the client sign Form 2848, which is a power of attorney form, then we can represent the IRS, represent them before the IRS and advocate for the client on their behalf. A lot of times the clients might get a notice in the mail and they think, I can just call up this agent and I'll just explain what happened and this will be all over in one phone call. And I think this is definitely my experience. I'm pretty sure you have had the same experience, Mark, that just isn't the case in almost every situation. Maybe 1 out of 1,000 that works. Most cases, it's going to require more back and forth with the agents. And the more technical tax issues that you're dealing with, the more important it is to have a representative. So someone who can help manage the process, help gather and organize the documentation so that way it can be sent to the agents, help manage and facilitate any interviews, either with the clients, if there are employees of the business that have pertinent information that the IRS wants to interview. You always want to have a representative there to make sure the questioning stays on track and, generally just answer the questions that are asked without trying to over explain and shorten the process. When it comes to actually gathering and sending in documentation, generally you don't have to create anything. So they pretty much ask for things that exist, and you don't have to make new documentation to respond to the agent. But it's really helpful if you are giving a large quantity of documentation. If you can provide a summary or a schedule of the documents that are there, that way the agent can look at that summary, start spot checking through the documentation that's provided. They don't have to spend an inordinate amount of time figuring out what you've provided to them. So while you're not required to create anything, sometimes it can be very helpful if you do create things like summaries and schedules. And if you're in the LB&I division and you have these draft IDRs, it's really important to review those and make sure you've identified any issues early on in the process so you can have them craft or tailor the final IDR that's issued to remove anything that is, you won't be able to respond to. Maybe they've asked for documentation for an issue and there's zero documentation because that issue doesn't really exist for that taxpayer. You would want to remove that from the final IDR. So that way you don't have to go back later and say, well, there's no documents for this. Don't bother looking at that when you could have taken care of it really early on in the process.
I think all of us have been through, several audits, at least as a tax professional. We've seen a lot of examinations, and occasionally a client will have an issue that maybe on the tax return, the position taken was pretty strong. There may be some potential disagreement with the IRS. How do you normally handle that with the agent when you think there may be an issue in question?
Just like many things, it depends on the issue. It depends on the facts. It depends on the law. Is it in favor of the client? How strong is it? So really it's situation by situation case. If the agent hasn't asked about it, most of the time I would not bring it up or offer it up unless there was, if we discovered something after the return was filed and we got the audit notice or the examination notice, we started taking a look through things, we find an error or something that was overlooked and inadvertently missed on the tax return. Those are the types of things we could bring up to the agent at the beginning and say, yeah, we took another look at it and there was some inadvertent clerical errors here on the return, and here's a list of those.
So at the end of the examination, what happens if the IRS wants to make a change to your tax return?
Yeah, the process varies a little bit depending on what type of tax return it is. If it's a 1040 versus a 1065 for a partnership, or 1120 or 1120S for a corporation. But generally, they're going to give you a report that will show all of the proposed changes, usually with a form 4549 and 886A attached to it that will show you a calculation of the changes, along with some narrative explanations on why they are proposing these changes. And it's just a proposal at that point. The taxpayers don't owe the tax at that date because there hasn't actually been any tax assessment. But you can agree or disagree with the report in total, or you can agree with some proposed changes and disagree with others. The caution there is that if you agree with some changes, then the IRS is going to separate those out and they're going to assess the tax on those changes and they're going to send it to collections, the IRS collection division, and they're going to try to get the client to pay that part of the tax assessment right away. And the changes that would be disagreed, those will go on to the appeals division, and that there won't be any assessment or tax owed on those immediately. So if you agree in part and disagree in part, it's sort of a decision point on should we just put the whole proposed report in dispute and take the whole thing onto appeals versus agreeing with some of these today, and then the client has to pay sooner on some of those ultimately agreed issues. If it's disagreed, there's definitely different options and different routes on how to get the client's case to IRS appeals. And I think we can cover that one maybe in our next podcast on dealing with the IRS and talk about the different ways to get to the IRS Office of Appeals and how the process differs depending on which route you take.
Well, thank you, Mike. This has been very helpful. I think most people, when the notice that they're being examined arrives in the mail or some fashion, they are fairly alarmed. And so hopefully some of this information will help calm people when they understand there is a process to this. And if you have representation, I think it is a bit better and maybe even easier.
Yeah, definitely. Anytime anybody gets a letter from the IRS, they always get a little nervous.
Right.
Usually because they don't get the letters that frequently. And you and I here in the tax industry, we see client notices all the time, and it's just part of what we deal with on a daily basis. But from the client's perspective, when they get that letter in the mail, yes, very scary. And most of the time they are very appreciative of having a representative who understands the process, who can explain it to them and, be side by side with them every step of the way and help shepherd them through the process. And most of the time, you can get to a satisfactory conclusion for both the taxpayer and the IRS. Sometimes it's a little tougher for the client at the end of the process, and you just try to bring them in for a soft landing and explain to them, here's what you're going to potentially owe in tax. Maybe there's penalties. We'll deal with those as they come up. And then what are the potential interest charges? And, we could probably do a whole series on what happens when the IRS is trying to collect payment from you. But there's many different parts of the IRS, and my best advice to any client or potential client is you do not need to deal with the IRS on your own. And there are those of us like you and me, Mark, that will help them deal with the IRS. And it's not the one-time experience like it is for the person who's just sitting at their kitchen table or in their office at their business with an envelope and a letter from the IRS. We deal with these all the time, and we are happy to help clients get through it as painlessly as possible.
That'll provide some assurance to people, because you're right. It is alarming. It is scary when you get a notice from the IRS. If you're not used to dealing with this, it is helpful to have a professional there to kind of shepherd the IRS through the process on behalf of the client and help to protect the client, because most people are not going to have to deal with anything worse than maybe penalties or interest. And I think most of us think the worst. Well, thank you, Mike.
Thank you for joining us on today's episode of the Balancing Act podcast by SingerLewak. You can tune in every Thursday morning to gain a sense of balance in the fast-paced industry of business. You can listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and our website. We'll see you next time.